Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning report for Tuesday, 8 April 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike. Let's get started with Inside the Beltway. Democrats held their first shadow hearing yesterday, and this was led by freshman Senator Adam Schiff, a California Democrat, and House Democrats, and said they are conducting oversight over the federal judiciary and the Department of Justice. And during this hearing, Schiff said that President Trump is taking unprecedented steps to, quote, bend our justice system to his will. I think clearly this has already been outlined as a strategy by Democrats, and Schiff is leading the charge on this political messaging campaign against the Trump administration and the congressional Republicans, who he said are effectively turning Congress into a rubber stamp for President Trump. The White House has ordered a new review on U.S. steel from the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And this is an entirely new review of this U.S. steel buyout plan they say in view of the Defense Production Act of 1950. And the final recommendation on this potential sale to Nippon Steel is due on the 22nd of May. And according to the White House, this must include national security risk mitigation measures by Nippon Steel. And then moving on, the Supreme Court and Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts temporarily blocked a Maryland District Court order directing the Trump administration to return to deported El Salvador national by midnight yesterday. And the Supreme Court also ruled that the Trump administration can continue deportations using the Alien Enemies Act. And this is a reversal of Washington, D.C. District Judge James Boasberg's temporary restraining order on the Trump administration. And as part of this decision, Roberts also ordered that the Venezuelan nationals that are suing the Trump administration need to actually file their lawsuits in Texas. I think at this point, multiple Supreme Court justices have signaled concerns that these district courts and the Trump administration are heading toward a constitutional crisis. And I think this constitutional crisis scenario would present the courts with a catch-22, because siding with Trump or pushing Trump to defy the courts would undermine the legitimacy of the courts. But I think they're trying to thread the needle here, especially Chief Justice John Roberts, of preventing a scenario in the case of this Maryland District Court deadline to re-import that El Salvador national, which would effectively force Trump to defy the courts, while this decision also allows the Trump resistance to claim a win because of that decision saying that they have to refile in Texas. Moving on to our roll-ups for today. The White House is considering drone strikes on cartels, and this is according to current and former U.S. officials. And they said the White House is in the early discussions on targeting cartel leaders and logistical networks, and they say that this would be in cooperation with the Mexican government. But according to these same officials, the White House has not ruled out unilateral covert action as an option of last resort to counter the cartels. And speaking of cartels, there's a new report out from a Virginia-based security firm called Global Guardian, and they said that U.S. businesses in Mexico are facing an increasing threat of extortion from cartels if the security landscape in Mexico does not see substantial changes. And according to their report that they released yesterday, 12% of U.S. firms in Mexico reported that they are facing extortion from organized criminal groups, and that these groups have taken partial control of the sales, distribution, or pricing of their goods. And 45% of these U.S. firms reported receiving extortion demands, including payments or ransoms. So this is, I think, part of what is pushing a lot of this cooperation between Sheinbaum's government and the Trump administration on these cartels, is that U.S. firms are facing a lot more danger in Mexico over the last few years, because these have been apparently drastic increases in this extortion that U.S. firms are facing. And more states are now considering nuclear to solve their energy shortages. And this is coming from Illinois and Montana, who are joining Colorado and Maryland, which we reported on last week, to push for more nuclear power development in their states. Illinois is right now considering a state bill that would actually repeal a ban on nuclear power plant construction, and Montana is considering a state bill that would approve nuclear waste storage sites. So more states, utilities, and nuclear technology developers see the Trump administration as friendly to nuclear power expansion. So I expect the support for nuclear at the state level, including the small modular reactors, to expand as we go further into the current Trump administration. And then finally, on the domestic side, The New York Civil Liberties Union said that the New York state government and law enforcement agencies are aggressively expanding their use of drones for surveillance and police investigations. The New York Civil Liberties Union is also saying that currently there are no state level regulations preventing New York law enforcement from arming these drones, and the New York authorities are also combining these drones with biometric technologies, which they say threaten New Yorkers' privacy and civil liberties. And while I have not seen that NYPD or any of these New York law enforcement agencies have armed drones yet, this is not an unprecedented discussion. This actually, back in 2022, the Oakland Police Department had a public hearing with civilian oversight groups where they actually debated arming some of their drones in order to, or in case of emergencies requiring them to use lethal force. And then, Jared, if you can come on and run us through your roll-up items, please.
Absolutely. President Trump and Iran both signaled that the U.S. and Iran would have talks on Saturday regarding a nuclear deal, but they seem to disagree on the details. Trump says that they'll be direct, while Iran says they'll be indirect and going through Oman. Regardless, the talks will happen Saturday. The U.S. also agreed to mediate the budding Turkey-Israel conflict. Sorry, having trouble getting that one out. Now, this was at the press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Trump agreed to mediate the tensions between Israel and Turkey, and Netanyahu described Turkey as using the Syrian bases to potentially attack Israel, and that the tensions were a conflict to be avoided. Moving over to the larger part of Asia, the Japanese defense minister, there's a significant allied drone buildup around Taiwan. The Japanese defense minister said that the U.S. is going to indefinitely deploy the MQ-4C Triton drones around the Kadena Air Base, and the MQ-4C is like a larger version of the Predator drone, so it's much more suited for maritime surveillance. And he said this would be happening within a few weeks. The Australian government also delivered 20 fixed-wing drones to the Philippine Coast Guard yesterday for maritime surveillance, and this is part of an ongoing civil maritime cooperation agreement between those two nations. Lastly, over in Europe, the European Union finance ministers are meeting in Warsaw this weekend to discuss a common defense fund. Now, Poland's defense minister, which, keeping in mind, Poland holds the presidency of the EU, Poland's finance minister is calling for all EU members to stop producing their own versions of weapons. So stop producing different rifles, stop producing different tanks, stop, as it goes. And the reason for that is that if you're going to build a common defense fund, you should be building common weapons, have, common supply chains. Now, the initial reports expect that this would actually cut their defense spending in half, because you have parts commonality across the entire continent, and allow for strategic level enablers that nations cannot afford on their own, which actually would assist in the U.S. stepping back from NATO and allow EU to take over the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe position.
Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to our warning items for today. And first up, Trump is escalating the U.S.-China trade war, and this is after China threatened to levy a 34% tariff on U.S. imports last week. And their 34% tariff is supposed to take effect on April 10th, the day after the ramp up of Trump's tariffs on all of our trade partners. Some of the response to this trade war has been interesting. There's an economist named Richard Baldwin who's based in Europe. He's a founder of Vox EU, and is also a fellow with the National Economic Research Board up in I think Boston. And he said that this U.S. tariff shock is going to lead to a more severe China shock and actually push other major economies to impose tariffs on Chinese imports to their own countries. He also said that there's a potential scenario here where, because the United States is only a portion of the global economy, we could see basically a block forming with the European Union and China at the head, trying to maintain the current global economic order. I'm a little bit skeptical of Europe and China allying with each other. I think right now, based on what Jared and I have reported on Europe's moves concerning trade with China, foreign direct investment, and Europe's neighbors. But China's Ministry of Commerce did respond to this potential escalation, saying that China will, quote, fight until the end And China's trade countermeasures are aimed at safeguarding China's sovereignty and maintaining the normal international order. And what I think is happening here is that the Trump administration is likely engaging in a strategy to contain China economically that would be parallel to this coming pivot to Asia, where the goal is to contain China militarily and politically in the Indo-Pacific. And I think the idea is to undermine Chinese industry with these trade barriers while making bilateral deals with other trade partners. We've seen a lot of these foreign trade partners come to the White House or reach out to the White House about lowering trade barriers. Bloomberg economic analysts are saying that all of these other foreign countries are facing a drop in exports to the U.S., are also going to face a glut of Chinese imports looking for new markets. And this is going to push them to impose their own tariffs on Chinese goods. I think, though, in the meantime, domestically, the U.S. is likely to see disruptions on some of these key supply chains that we've been covering for the last couple of years. That includes pharmaceuticals, electronics, and critical minerals as this U.S.-China trade war escalates. And China has already, I think, announced additional export controls on some key minerals, key critical minerals, not just to the U.S., but to all other recipients of Chinese imports. I have seen that some industries, including pharmaceuticals, have already begun planning to reshore supply chains, but this is likely a long-term issue where we're going to face a lot of, or potentially a lot of, supply chain disruptions on some of these key goods. And even in the long term, some of these things like the active pharmaceutical ingredients are going to rely on overseas supply chains. There was an interesting article put out by Ray Dalio on this last night that I read, where he actually supported the tariffs. But he said this is part of a larger plan by the Trump administration to try to stabilize the United States against destabilizing forces both globally and internally, especially around the economy. So I think it's going to be interesting to see where the Trump administration and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent move when it comes to trying to secure U.S. economic stability and fiscal stability, which is Ray Dalio, as we talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, warned House Republicans on putting in these unfunded tax cuts. And I think the view here is that this is one move from Ray Dalio's perspective, one move towards restabilizing the U.S. politically. All right, Jared, if you could come on and take us through your warning item for today. You're muted, Jared.
Sorry about that. Huntington Ingalls and the Hyundai Heavy Industries signed an agreement yesterday. This is to accelerate ship production through quote, in support of defense and commercial shipping projects through technology exchange, lessons learned, and component outsourcing, which you'll notice those are the two big issues with shipping that the U.S. has been trying to address: is how do we make more warships? How do we develop a proper commercial fleet? Now, both companies are licensed to produce Aegis destroyers, with Huntington Ingalls producing the Arleigh Burke and up to the Flight 3s, which are the most up-to-date Arleigh Burkes that we have. And Hyundai is producing the Sejong, which is basically a carbon copy of the Arleigh Burkes. Now, this deal, I think, is likely to garner significant government support because basically there's a global need right now to break away from China's shipping dominance. You name a country that's not allied very closely with China, they're all looking at this going, we need to figure out how to not use Chinese ships. And South Korea is one of the top three shipbuilders, with the other one being Japan and China. Now, Hyundai is reportedly capable of building up to 5 Aegis destroyers a year, and I think they could potentially bring the American shipyards up to a similar level due to the similarity in ship structures. Like I said, the Sejong and the Arleigh Burkes are basically the same ship. When we license them out, they're making very, very similar ships.
So just real quick, you're saying that Huntington Ingalls could bring the other U.S. shipyards up to that production capacity. How many, if they were to bring every U.S. shipyard up to that 5 destroyers a year, do you know how many that would actually be? I'm
saying the company could be brought to that level.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm saying that to be conservative. I think we could potentially hit 5 a year with some significant work. That said, if the South Koreans do have a a very productive plan, and Huntington Ingalls, which we covered last week, that they were readjusting their entire hiring process anyway to get more experienced shipyard workers, which makes you more efficient by having more experienced shipyard workers. Potentially, we could see more than one shipyard hit that, but I think that is a very long-term goal. You're talking about way past the 2027 expected deadline. But that would mean in the future, the U.S. is much more secure and able to secure global supply chains again.
Well, that does seem to be the goal of the Trump administration, right? That was I think the point of this potential, I think $1 million to $1.5 million port entry fee on Chinese-made ships is to get this ship production capacity ramped up. Have you seen anything on this, developments on the civilian side, especially U.S. made cargo ships?
So both of these companies produce commercial ships, but I couldn't find their capacity right off the bat. Now, I obviously with this being explicitly, on both sides, as commercial and defense, we will see an increase in commercial shipping production, and they will also use lessons learned from the Koreans right off the bat. So it should make some fairly high quality ships. If I remember right, I want to say the Koreans are the ones that make more ships, and still fairly high technology, and the Japanese make a little bit less capacity wise, but they make higher quality ships, which I think that is probably going to come down as well. Mitsubishi's very important. They also make Aegis destroyers. It wouldn't shock me to find this ends up being trilateral instead of bilateral.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers today. And we have our first question from Bad Wabbit. This shadow government idea of sedition at best and treasonous at worst. What is the possible legal options the administration has to fight this? Well, this is not uncommon, the use of these shadow hearings. It's not necessary. So shadow government, when you're talking unconventional warfare, or in like the Westminster system, where the parties maintain what they call their shadow cabinet, which is just the members of parliament who would be cabinet ministers if they were in power. This is not that. This is something that the minority party in Congress has done in the past. And all it is that the minority party will call a hearing, but they don't have the power to issue subpoenas or force witnesses to testify. So in this case, this is purely political warfare, political messaging, where the Democrats are trying to put out media messaging on Trump's executive actions, in this case, specifically Department of Justice. And there's not really a hard number on how often these shadow hearings happen, because there's as far as I could see, the Congressional Research Service doesn't really track that, and there's no. So, because what I'm looking for is to see if this is starting to increase. The use of these shadow hearings has increased in the recent past, but that's difficult to pin down just because there's nobody really tracking how many of these shadow hearings occur. But I don't think there's any real legal options the Trump administration has to stop this, because this is the Democrats, congressional Democrats aren't breaking the law here or anything like that. They're not going against congressional norms. And this is really just a political messaging hearing. And then let's get some more questions in. Griseo Nemo, has the process to get a reactor approved from the NRC gotten any easier? I think that there's been some back and forth on permitting issues with the NERC, FERC, and NRC. As far as I understand, the Trump administration has been pushing to get these permitting processes streamlined to allow, the construction of these new reactors. Part of the problem, I think, was that at the state level, a lot of the states that had these clean energy mandates, like Illinois, some of the Northeast states, they did not, and Colorado, actually, in this example, did not include nuclear in their definition of clean energy when they passed state level laws saying they had to have 100% clean energy by 2030, 2040, 2050. And so I'm starting to see some of this change, where at the state level, they're now going to allow, or they're trying to solicit, this nuclear power plant construction. I think they are potentially, I think there is still a potential risk for these nuclear power developers that they'll run into lawsuits from environmental groups that will focus on this on NRC permitting process. All right, and then let's see if we have any more questions. I did see Jared, if you wanted to talk about this trade war situation and what China means as far as trying to ensure their sovereignty.
Sure. So on we'll just review the Ministry of Commerce's quote real quick. It was the countermeasures China has taken are aimed at safeguarding its sovereignty, security, development interests, and maintaining the international trade order. I think it's interesting that they tie their sovereignty into the international trade order, because what that means is, like, if you disrupt the international trade order, that is a direct threat to their sovereignty, which is cause for war. But also, if you disrupt their international trade order, that means that they also run the risk of no longer being sovereign. I think that's going to encourage the Trump administration to continue pressing, and that may even be a show of weakness to other Asian countries, because what that effectively says is, oh, we are only secure because the American government, the American Navy secures the shipping lanes in the international trade order. That is a very weak sign from the Ministry of Commerce. And I think it's going to bolster the anti-China coalition over in the Pacific.
Well, I think it's an interesting idea. This is very common with China, as far as I understand, is every issue globally or domestically is a domestic issue. And so, but I think part of the mandate of heaven for the CCP is economic growth, and has been for decades now. So if this trade war were to undercut that economic growth, I could see that they view this as a threat to regime security, even if they're not necessarily sovereignty as we would see, but regime security, because that would undermine their mandate, their governing mandate.
All right. Well,
all right. Well, that's the end of if that's the end of our questions for today. We'll be back with you tomorrow at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.